Warning, this video contains spoilers for Queer. It's been a big year for filmmakers making big comebacks after a couple of years, and I truthfully think that out of everyone that's been making anything all year round, the MVP has to go to Luca Guadagnino. The man has such a rich catalogue of films, from Call Me By Your Name being the big one that kind of put all the traction on him, and I mean it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, it won screenplay. Then he went on to do the Suspiria remake, which is something that's so hard to do, remaking a film and making it completely different and much more grand in lore and scale. I mean, that original Suspiria is literally my favourite film of all time, so I was scared that this guy was going to butcher it, and of course, he did a fantastic job. And then, yeah, there was Bones and All a couple of years later. Another fantastic film, and I think it's kind of fair to say that him and Timothy just work so well together. However, this year we've been blessed with two of his new films. Obviously, I've praised Challengers to death. It's my most viewed video on this channel. He didn't stop there. This week, Queer releases everywhere, more or less. I was able to score the opportunity to go and see it early a couple days ago, and this is wild. It's incredibly respectable for a filmmaker to put two films out in the same year, you know, it's been done before. It's quite impressive to see filmmakers do stuff like this. However, with Luca, it's so insane to put two films that are just completely different out. Challengers is this raunchy, fast-paced tennis movie, and then you have Queer, which is the complete opposite. It follows Lee, who's played by Daniel Craig. He recounts his life in Mexico City as he attempts to pursue a young boy called Eugene, who is a discharged US Navy serviceman. When I first walked out, I was kind of like, it was good, but I don't know if it was for me. And then I started thinking about it more and more and more. And I think today's video, I kind of just want to talk about the ending and the way that I interpret that, because this for me is a film that can generally just be interpreted in several different ways. And I just wanted to give my point of view on it, because I feel like this is something that a few people are going to walk out of and completely question what the fuck they just saw. It's wild as well at the start of the year that a lot of us were talking about this being an Oscar contender. Not to say that the movie's bad, but it's so experimental and out there in some of its portrayals, very Lynchian in some places, and honestly it just kind of surprised me a lot, and I don't think Oscar voters are going to particularly enjoy a lot of what this film has to offer, but Daniel Craig's definitely a lock-in for Best Actor anyway, so who cares. The film is divided up into three parts. The first part takes place in Mexico City and is kind of the intro to the movie, although for an intro it's like most of the movie. Part 2 takes place in some of South America as the two go on traveling, and part 3 takes place in this jungle. And then there's an epilogue that kind of wraps the entire film up. Parts 3 and the epilogue are probably the two things that I'm going to focus on discussing the most here, because they're the two things that really kind of threw me off, and I was sat like, thank God I didn't watch any trailers for this, because this has completely thrown me away. As the film progresses into its second and third act, it becomes very apparent that Lee is absolutely head over heels obsessed with Eugene. There's a certain desire for his body that's used more as an instrument than a piece of the human body, but the whole idea becomes so much more clear in the third act as they enter this jungle. Lee's on a search to find this drug that could in some way provide what they're looking for and give him the connection that he really wants with Eugene, and eventually they make it to this little hut lived in by Dr. Cotter, who does all this research on this type of stuff. Eventually it gets to the point where the two of them take ayahuasca and have this ridiculous trip out scene. I need to know all the behind the scenes on how they filmed this, because it just is so dreamlike and wild, and it's clearly like overlapping footage on each other. It just works incredibly well. Eventually though, the effects of the drugs begin to wear off, and Eugene lets Lee down and tells him, listen, I don't care what we've gone through in this entire film, what's happened, I'm not queer. And this absolutely destroys Lee. This goes on through the trip scene as well, where Lee is constantly trying to interlink the two of them together, and Eugene just continuously pushes him away and away and away. But eventually it gets to the next day. The two wake up. It's kind of this bittersweet moment in the film as Lee kind of knows where everything's gonna go. He knows that Eugene's gonna inevitably leave, and then that's it. There's nothing he can do about it. Dr. Carter sits with Eugene and speaks to him, and she says this quote that portrays everything that the movie's trying to execute, which is, the door's already open. There's no going back now. All you can do is look away. But why would you? Basically telling Eugene, you know that these feelings are real, so why neglect them? Lee and Eugene settle back on their adventure to leave the forest, but Lee loses Eugene, looks down, looks back up, he's gone, and this is the last time that he ever sees him. But then that takes us to the epilogue, which is titled simply 2 years later. This is where everything goes fucking insane. As Lee returns to Mexico City, he bumps into his old friend Joe, who is played by Jason Schwartzman, who's completely unrecognizable throughout most of this film. Eventually he he breaks the news that Eugene actually left and went to South America as a tour guide. This is when everything just goes absolutely insane. It pans back to the hotel room that we were met with at the start of the movie. In the hotel room on the table, there's a replica of the hotel that he's in. He looks in and sees a miniature version of himself walking to the room that he's already in. The way that I interpret this is that the dollhouse is meant to be something that Lee's lived in. It's basically his past memories. It showcases Lee's wish for going back into the past, going into the time before he even knew who Eugene was, a time that he would probably describe as simpler. This isn't a way to try and forget about all this, but more a way to try and relive it and do things right, and find an ending that he'd be happier with. We're then met with a snake on the floor, which is eating itself, and the snake also begins to cry. And then we pan onto Eugene, who's in the bed, who has the centipede necklace on his chest that Omar Apollo was wearing at the start of the film. The way that I view this is the centipede and the snake are both representative of Lee and Eugene. Lee being the snake, continuously going through this cycle of trying to pursue younger men and then them leaving, and him being lonely and going back into addiction and alcohol and drugs. Whereas Eugene being the centipede is constantly moving. He's young, he has his whole life ahead of him and can really do whatever he wants. He's not restricted by all of these mental health issues or strapped down by any sort of addiction, so he's bound to continue moving forward. At the end of the scene, Lee actually shoots Eugene, and this is his way of finally just letting go. He runs over, he cries, he realizes, well fuck, what have I done? I've erased the one thing in my life that I actually held tender to me. And that's the sad ending. The hopelessness of knowing that it's over. You can't go back in the past and relive those moments, and you can't try and better them. It just is what it is. Final scene of the film witnesses Lee returning into the room and sitting down. However, this time he's significantly older and he gets into the bed. As he's in bed, he tries to sleep, but everything to do with Eugene is just constantly hitting him in the head at once. He remembers all of it from start to finish. At the same time, to me, this isn't something like he's haunted by this regret anymore. This is more that Eugene represents everything in his life that absolutely pestered him and provided him with some happiness, but in the long term left him lonely and miserable and alone. The room begins to change around him as everything becomes so much more translucent. It's very reminiscent of the ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Honestly, they're actually like incredibly similar endings now that I think about it. Again, he begins to imagine himself younger with Eugene, and this is the ending of the film, which serves as a final reminder that although he was chasing these dreams and people and desires and sexuality for his whole life, he's died alone, and that's it. I think at first seeing this, it just led me to overthink everything I was watching. I had no real idea what was happening, but now that I can actually sit down and reflect on it, I definitely want to see the film again and try and get even more of an understanding, because there's definitely a lot that I missed out there. But to me, that's how I interpret the ending of Queer. If you have different interpretations or you viewed it in a different way, please comment down below. Let me know how wrong I am or how correct I am. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.